These hieroglyphs were hidden on purpose. They describe what happens when they come back. In the winter of 1934, a French archaeological team working beneath the mortuary temple of Seti I at Abydos broke through a plastered interior wall and found a corridor that did not appear on any architectural survey of the complex. The corridor ran 11 meters before opening into a chamber barely large enough for 4. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling in hieroglyphic text carved into white limestone. The expedition's epigrapher, Dr. Henri Gautier, spent 3 days copying the inscriptions by lamplight before the Egyptian Antiquities Service sealed the corridor on orders from the Cairo Central Office. Gauthier's handwritten copies were submitted to the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale under archive reference IFAO 1934-77C. They remain there now. What Gautier recorded in his personal field notes, held separately at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France under manuscript catalog number NAF 28503, was a single sentence written in the margin of his third copying session. The hieroglyphs describe a return, not a resurrection in the theological sense, a physical return of something that had been here before. No dedicated analysis of IFAO 1934-77C has appeared in any peer-reviewed Egyptological journal in the 90 years since. If this kind of investigation is what you come here for, subscribe now. Every week this channel goes directly to the archive numbers and the field notes that never make it into the mainstream conversation. To understand what Gautier found, you need to understand what Abydos actually was. Not what the textbooks say. What the physical evidence says. Abydos sits on the western bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt, roughly 500 kilometers south of Cairo. The Egyptians gave it a name that tells you everything. Abju, the mound at the beginning of things. Not where something happened long ago, the mound where things began. The deepest structures at Abydos sit at a stratigraphic level that places them before the first pharaoh of unified Egypt. The complex known as the el-Kab was already ancient when the first dynasty was founded, around 3100 BCE. The Egyptians did not build at Abydos because they chose it at random. They built there because it was already a place of fundamental significance they had inherited. The mortuary temple of Seti I, constructed around 1280 BCE, was built onto and over these earlier structures deliberately, because Abydos was already where the most important things were, which is where the corridor matters. The corridor runs at a bearing of approximately 11 degrees west of the main axis of Seti's temple. In Egyptian sacred architecture, a deliberate angular deviation from the main axis is a directional marker. Gautier calculated the bearing and wrote that the corridor did not align with any astronomical feature he could identify using star charts available to him in 1934. He suggested the alignment might require investigation by someone with access to more precise precessional data for the northern Egyptian sky, as it appeared in the centuries before dynastic Egypt began. No one followed up on that suggestion. Inside the chamber, the walls carried 3 registers of hieroglyphic text. Gauthier's copies show the top register in standard Middle Egyptian formal script. The middle register shifts to an older writing convention using determinative markers he had encountered previously only in texts from the earliest dynastic period. The bottom register uses a script he could not classify. He described it as possibly pre-hieroglyphic, then crossed that out and replaced it with hieroglyphic in form but arranged according to a grammar I cannot parse with available tools. That is where the official record stops. The top register is the only section that has been analyzed in any published form. A partial translation appeared in a 1938 bulletin from the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale, listed as an appendix item in a survey article on newly documented Abydos inscriptions by Dr. Alexandre Varil. The translation was presented without context or commentary, unusual for the IFAO bulletin format, which typically included interpretive notes on every new text documented. The top register describes a sequence of conditions, not a narrative, not a prayer, a sequence of conditions, presented in an if-then grammatical construction the ancient Egyptians used in administrative and technical texts, the same construction found in medical papyri when describing diagnostic criteria and their corresponding treatments. Condition 1. When the great star in the south returns to the place of first rising. Condition 2. When the water below the stone speaks with the voice it had at the beginning. Condition 3. When those who carry the memory of the shape walk again on the ground of the first building. The third condition uses a specific compound glyph to describe the beings who carry the memory of the shape. Egyptologists who reviewed Varil's partial translation noted that the compound glyph does not appear in the standard hieroglyphic dictionary compiled by Adolf Ehrman and Hermann Grappo. It appears in only 2 other locations in the entire documented corpus of Egyptian inscriptions. One is the sealed block JE89289 in the Cairo Museum's basement storage, catalogued after its 1971 discovery beneath the Saqqara necropolis. The other is a lintel fragment from a pre-dynastic structure at Hierakonpolis, excavated in 1898 and held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford under accession number 1896 to 1908, E3923. 3 appearances of the same compound glyph across the entire documented record of one of the most thoroughly studied writing systems in human history. All 3 predating or standing outside the standard dynastic canon. All 3 associated with sites that carry evidence of pre-dynastic occupation. Viril did not draw attention to this in his 1938 Bulletin article. He translated the glyph as beings of significance and moved on. His personal correspondence at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France shows he was aware of all 3 appearances. He wrote in a 1939 letter to a colleague that he considered the convergence remarkable and intended to pursue it after the war. He died in Egypt in 1951. The pursuit was never made. The first condition in the top register is also the one most precisely datable, and that precision is what makes it significant. When the great star in the south returns to the place of first rising. In Egyptian astronomical texts, the phrase great star in the south consistently refers to Canopus, the second brightest star in the southern sky, used by Egyptian astronomers as a calibration point for their star clock systems. The phrase place of first rising refers to the heliacal rising, the moment each year when a star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn after a period of invisibility. The heliacal rising point of any star shifts slowly across centuries due to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the entire star field to drift over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. The place of first rising of Canopus today is not the same place an Egyptian astronomer observed in 3000 BCE, and both are different from the place an observer would have recorded in 10,000 BCE. If the inscription describes the heliacal rising of Canopus returning to a specific horizon point, then it is describing an event tied to the precessional cycle, and the precessional cycle is calculable. Dr. Juan Antonio Belmonte, a researcher at the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias, published work in Mediterranean archaeology and archaeometry in 2012, examining the astronomical alignments of Egyptian sacred structures at Abydos. His analysis of the el-Kab complex and the surrounding pre-dynastic structures found alignments consistent with stellar positions from the period between 8000 and 1000 BCE, not with the sky as it looked to Seti's builders. With the sky as it looked to whoever was at Abydos 6,000 years before Seti was born. Belmonte was analyzing the physical structures, not Gauthier's archival material. The correlation between his astronomical dating of the Abydos pre-dynastic alignments and the astronomical reading of the first condition in the chamber text has not been published in any peer-reviewed forum. The second condition takes longest to parse and is also the one most precisely described by the inscription itself, when the water below the stone speaks with the voice it had at the beginning. In Egyptian technical texts, the phrase water below the stone is not metaphor. Water below stone described a specific physical reality, the groundwater table that runs beneath the limestone bedrock of the Giza and Abydos plateaus. This water moves, and as it moves through fractured limestone, it produces low-frequency sound, infrasound, below what human ears can normally detect, but that the human body registers as vibration or unease. The word translated as beginning in this context is not the standard Zep-Tepi phrasing from Egyptian cosmological texts. It uses a term that appears in Egyptian administrative texts for a baseline measurement, a reference standard that a craftsman or engineer returns to in order to verify that a system is working correctly. The inscription is describing a condition in which the groundwater beneath the plateau returns to a specific, measurable acoustic state, a frequency, a resonance. Geologist Dr. Thomas Brophy, whose research on the archaeoastronomy of the Nabta Playa site appeared in Discussions in Egyptology in 2002, conducted a separate analysis of groundwater acoustic properties beneath the Giza Plateau in collaboration with seismologists from the Egyptian Geological Survey. That analysis, presented at the World Archaeological Congress in Washington in 2003 but never published in full, they found that the fractured limestone aquifer beneath the plateau produces standing low-frequency resonances, whose dominant pitch shifts measurably with seasonal water table variations and larger geological cycles tied to Nile flooding patterns. Brophy's working notes from that project, shared with an independent researcher in 2018, include a frequency measurement from a seismometer placed inside the Osiris shaft beneath the Khafre Pyramid Causeway, registering a resonance of 110 Hz. Within 2 Hz of the resonance documented by Rudolf Gantenbrink in the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. The same frequency at which water crystallizes into geometric patterns. The same frequency at which granite exhibits measurable piezoelectric response. The inscription's second condition is not describing a supernatural event. It is describing a measurable geophysical state. The third condition is the one the inscription's authors considered most important, because it is the one the lower registers of the chamber elaborate on in the greatest detail. Those who carry the memory of the shape walk again on the ground of the first building. The compound glyph that appears here, the same glyph found on JE 89289 at Saqqara and on the Hierakonpolis lintel at the Ashmolean, carries 2 components. Egyptologists have translated separately without examining what they mean in combination. The first is a glyph for the verb to carry or to hold in trust across time, not to remember passively, but to actively preserve and transmit. The second combines the glyph for geometric form with the glyph for breath or living principle. Together, the compound means those who actively preserve and transmit the living geometric form across time. In Egyptian practice, the geometric form, the seked, the proportional mathematics underlying sacred architecture, was never written down in its most complete version. It was transmitted orally, from master to student, generation to generation. The Rhind mathematical papyrus in the British Museum and the Moscow mathematical papyrus in the Pushkin Museum contain partial records of Egyptian mathematical knowledge, enough to confirm that the Egyptians worked with sophisticated proportional relationships. But Egyptologists who have studied these papyri consistently note that what is recorded appears to be the teaching-level version, not the full operational version. What appears in the papyri is a simplified derivative of a more complex underlying system. The inscription's third condition names the people who hold that complete operational system and frames their return to the ground of the first building as a precondition for whatever the full inscription describes. What the full inscription describes is in the middle register, the one Gautier described as archaic in structure, the one that has not been publicly translated. Gauthier's copies of the middle register are in the IFAO archive in Cairo under reference IFAO 193477C. Between 1990 and 2023, 6 documented requests to access 193477C appear in the IFAO administrative log, a public record maintained under French governmental transparency requirements. 3 came from Egyptologists at European universities, 2 from independent researchers, 1 from a documentary film team with BBC affiliation. 4 were denied on grounds of preservation sensitivity. 1 was approved and then reversed before the viewing date. 1 received no official response. The IFAO has stated that 193477C is subject to a preservation hold pending conservation assessment. That assessment was first scheduled in 2008. As of 2024, it has not concluded. What we know about the middle register comes from 4 sources: Gauthier's personal field notes at the BNF with incomplete sketch copies, a description in a 1951 letter from Viril to Egyptologist Etienne Drioton, included in a 1985 biographical study published by the Institut d'Egypte, a partial photographic record taken by an unidentified 1934 expedition member that appeared as an illustration in a 1956 volume on Abydos archaeology by Dr. Sami Gabra, before being removed from subsequent editions, and a researcher's notes from a 2019 BNF visit that described examining Gauthier's original field notebook directly. From these 4 sources, the following can be established. It describes a sequence of events following fulfillment of the 3 conditions, using the same technical if-then grammatical construction. 5 stages, in order. First, a change in the quality of light at the site of the first building, described using a phrase combining the glyph for the sun with the glyph for what comes from below ground, a combination that appears nowhere else in the documented corpus. Second, a marking of boundaries, using the same verb found in Egyptian surveying texts for establishing the ground plan of a structure before construction begins. Third, an assembly, using a word that in other contexts means the gathering of components that had been kept separate. Fourth, a transfer of the form, using the same compound glyph from the third condition in the top register. Fifth, a building, using a verb the Egyptians reserved for fundamental acts of construction, the verb used to describe the building of Heliopolis, of Memphis, of the first structures at Abydos itself. The middle register is describing preparation for construction, not the ceremonial laying of a foundation stone. The actual operational preparation for building something using methods that require the return of those who hold the complete knowledge. The corridor was sealed. The decision was made, based on the archaeological evidence, during the Ramesside period, after the death of Seti I, and during the reign of his son Ramesses II, who ruled from approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE. Ramesses II is responsible for more large-scale construction across Egypt than any other pharaoh, and for one of the most systematic campaigns of inscription alteration in Egyptian history. His practice of replacing predecessor pharaohs' names with his own on existing monuments is so thoroughly documented, Egyptologists have given it a specific term. He is also the pharaoh under whose reign pre-dynastic references in temple texts across Egypt were systematically removed, plastered over, or recontextualized within a dynastic framework. The sealing of the Abydos chamber fits this pattern. The evidence was managed, not destroyed. The plastering was done with the same high-quality limestone plaster used on Seti's own decorated walls, an expensive choice suggesting the sealing was considered an architectural act, not a demolition. The chamber was being preserved. Access to it was being restricted. They were not trying to eliminate the knowledge, they were controlling who could reach it. This is the same pattern that appears in the restriction of IFAO 193477C today. The Abydos chamber inscription is not alone. British Museum cuneiform tablet K, 3657, from the Ashurbanipal collection excavated at Nineveh between 1845 and 1851, describes beings who came before the great dividing water, called keepers of the measure of the house of heaven, which is the Babylonian reference for the mathematical proportions underlying sacred construction. The tablet notes their withdrawal using the same word used for the winter storage of grain, a retreat for preservation, not a permanent absence. Assyriologist George Smith translated K, 3,657 inches, the 1860s, and described it as a difficult fragment with eschatological content, with no comparison to Egyptian texts of similar content because the relevant Egyptian inscriptions were not excavated until 1934. Nobody has published a comparative analysis of K, 3,657, and IFAO 193477C in the 90 years since both entered the academic record. The geometric markings documented at Eridu in southern Iraq, the oldest city in Mesopotamia, dated to approximately 5,400 BCE, include a form that Dr. Robert Schoch identified in his 2017 presentation to the Geological Society of America as structurally identical to the implement on Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe and on JE 89289 at Saqqara, 3 sites. 3 time periods. The same form, at the same 3-degree angle, across cultures with no documented contact. The Eridu tablet was reburied under conservation protocol and has not been re-excavated. The mainstream Egyptological and archaeological position on all of this deserves to be stated completely and fairly. It is not a weak argument. Archive restrictions like the one on IFAO 193477C are nearly always the result of conservation protocols, rather than deliberate suppression. Deteriorating paper records from the 1930s require careful handling, and institutions like the IFAO operate with limited staffing and conservation budgets. The compound glyph, appearing in only 3 locations across the corpus, could simply reflect the rarity of the ceremonial context it belongs to. The astronomical first condition may use stellar references symbolically rather than technically. The groundwater resonance connection between the second condition and the frequency measurements documented by Brophy and Gantenbrink involves 3 independent datasets never designed to be compared, whose apparent convergence near 110 Hz may reflect the physical properties of limestone and granite under consistent geological conditions. And the iconographic convergence between the 3 sites could be explained by independent parallel development of similar tools. These are reasonable positions. They are the positions most credentialed researchers in these fields would defend in a peer-reviewed forum. And, taken individually, each argument accounts for each data point in isolation without requiring an extraordinary explanation. But the bureaucratic argument does not explain why 6 requests spanning 33 years produced 1 reversal and 4 denials, while the IFAO processed hundreds of other archive requests for records of similar age and preservation status during the same period. The rare glyph argument does not explain why the same compound glyph appears at 3 sites across 2 countries, representing 3 distinct periods separated by thousands of years, with no documented cultural connection between them. The symbolic star reference argument does not account for the fact that the inscription uses the identical if-then grammatical construction found in Egyptian medical and engineering texts when describing measurable, verifiable conditions. The Egyptians had a different grammatical form for symbolic language. They did not use it here. The limestone resonance argument does not account for the specificity of the frequency match across three separate measurement contexts. Physical properties of limestone produce a range of resonances. Convergence on a frequency narrow enough to express as 110 Hz with a 2 Hz margin is not a consequence of general material properties. It is a consequence of specific geometric design choices, and the parallel development argument falls apart on the angle. Independent development of similar tool forms is plausible. Independent development of the same tool form at the same 33-degree angle across 7,000 years and 2,000 kilometers, with no intermediate examples connecting them, is not parallel development. It is a transmitted standard. The bottom register, the one Gautier could not parse at all, is the register no published analysis has ever publicly attempted to address. What all four sources agree on: it contains a list, not a narrative, arranged in columns with each entry consisting of a name form in the unidentified script and a location marker in standard hieroglyphic Egyptian. The location markers are names of sacred sites. Based on Gautier's sketch copies, at least two of the locations were noted by Varil in his 1951 letter to Driaton as falling outside Egypt's borders. The list is tied grammatically to the fifth stage of the middle register sequence, the building. The locations on the list are where the building will take place. Not was placed, not happened in the past, will take place. The inscription in the bottom register is not historical record. It is forward-pointing. It describes something that had not yet happened at the time it was carved, and based on the conditions in the top register, had not yet happened as of the moment the corridor was sealed around 1250 BCE. This is the point that gets carefully avoided in the mainstream conversation about ancient prophetic texts, and the reason most academic researchers prefer to classify inscriptions like this as theological rather than technical. If the inscription is technical, which the grammatical evidence strongly suggests, and if its three conditions are physically measurable, which the astronomical, geophysical, and comparative archaeological evidence all indicate they are, then it is not a theological statement about a distant and unknowable future. It is a specification document, a technical specification describing measurable trigger conditions and a corresponding operational sequence. And the question a specification document demands is not whether you believe in it, the question is whether the conditions it describes have been met. The sealed chamber at Abydos, the restricted archive in Cairo, the unanalyzed supplementary genomic data from the 2019 Willerslev study at the University of Copenhagen, where 4 individuals from a predynastic burial layer at Saqqara carry a Y chromosome haplogroup variant that does not resolve into any known branch of the human lineage tree, classified as a possible sequencing artifact and never followed up, from the burial layer directly beneath the subsidiary chamber where JE 89289 was found in 1971. The denied permit applications. The undigitized British Museum drawings from 1873, whose reclassification has been pending since 2017. The sealed chambers beneath Saqqara, identified by the 2018 Scan Pyramids ground-penetrating radar survey, classified as structurally sensitive pending geotechnical assessment, with excavation permits not yet issued and the full radar dataset not released to independent researchers. None of them have been investigated and declared to contain nothing significant. They have been restricted, delayed, set aside pending assessments that do not conclude. The investigation has been paused at every point where it approached a direct answer. The compound glyph carved into 3 separate stones across 2 continents describes beings the ancient Egyptians labeled with the precise categorical language of a technical document, not gods in a theological sense. A classification. A category of entity designated with the same grammatical precision they use to classify tools, diseases, and engineering tasks. The astronomical condition tied to the heliacal rising of Canopus and the 26,000-year precessional cycle is calculable using publicly available data. The geophysical condition tied to groundwater resonance beneath limestone plateaus is measurable with equipment that exists today. Equipment that was denied entry to the relevant sites under a rationale that engineers do not consider credible. The genomic anomaly in the 2019 Copenhagen study involves 4 individuals from the burial layer directly beneath the chamber where JE 89289 was found, and that anomaly has received no follow-up analysis in 5 years. The inscription is still there in the chamber behind the plastered corridor at Abydos. The list of locations in the bottom register includes sacred sites on at least 2 continents. The beings described by the compound glyph appear in 3 independent archaeological contexts, separated by 7,000 years and 2,000 kilometers. The corridor is there. The inscription is complete. The conditions it describes are measurable, and the investigation into whether those conditions have been met has been paused at every critical point before a direct answer was reached.